I'm Newell Bringhurst, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents,
the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Newell Bringhurst back on the show. He's the biographer of Ervil B. Lee. Harold is interesting in the fact that he probably had the shortest tenure of any church LDS prophet, but he has a reach that extends far beyond his presidency with his dabbling in correlation. So it's going to be a great conversation. You won't want to miss it. Check it out. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a return guest. I think this is his fourth time. You're coming up there with Matt Harris. I've had him on 4 times. So tell us who you are first.
Well, I'm Newell Bringhurst, and as Rick has pointed out, I've been on Gospel Tangents 3 previous times. I'm an independent scholar, retired professor of history and political science from College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California. And I've had a lifelong passion and interest in Latter-day Saint history and studies.
Yes, so one of my favorite historians, Noel. I don't know if you knew that, but that's true. So we're here to talk about, I think this is your latest book, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So why don't you show us to the camera this book that we're going to be talking about today?
Ervil B. Lee, His Life and Thought. And it was an unintended biography. I had no intention whatsoever of doing this biography, unlike other major works that I've done in the past. I usually say I want to look at that topic or that individual more carefully. And Ervil B. Lee was one of those that came out of left field, so to speak. It was actually Gary Bajera who coerced me with a $5,000 honorarium if I would do a short biography for this series that they're putting together, which is akin to the various short biography series that have been done on American historical figures, on world historical figures. They wanted a short, succinct biography, and I couldn't resist the temptation to do it because I'd previously done a similarly short biography on Brigham Young for the Library of American Biography series, which was edited by the prestigious Harvard historian Oscar Handlin. And I guess Gary was in kind of the role of being the local Oscar Handlin in being the overall supervisorial editor of this series. And mine was the first in a series of short biographies on major Mormon figures. The second one that just recently came out is one done by Gary Topping on Michael Quinn.
Oh yes, that's another one. I've read this one. I haven't read that one yet. So I'm excited to talk about Ervil B. Lee because I know you told me off camera one time that he was not your favorite character.
Far from it. I always looked at him as a little bit of a counter figure because he, I guess a lot of it was his very conservative views, orthodox conservative views, particularly on the issue of race, because he kind of stood out to me as a major figure who stood in the way of lifting the black priesthood ban when Hugh B. Brown was pushing for it to be lifted back in 1969. And he put the kibosh on that. He was the one that said, well, instead of lifting the ban, we're going to reassert the ban as essential Mormon doctrine, which was done through the 1969 statement saying that it is a doctrine. And that had reinforced an earlier statement when it was first proclaimed as being doctrine back in 1949. It was like a restatement of what had been said 20 years earlier, a sort of doubling down on the part of Ervil B. Lee. So, as I say, he was not one of my favorite figures because I had as you're aware, I had done a number of careful studies on the Black Priesthood ban.
Saints, Slaves, and Blacks, which is a great book, by the way. And you've got a new second edition out, right?
Right. Yeah, Greg Colford has just published this. I think it was 2018, 2019, when they reissued it with a new introduction and some additional material. That I left the text pretty much as I had originally written it, because I didn't feel like my ideas had really changed that much, and I felt, in fact, that they had been affirmed and confirmed by subsequent scholars, including Armin Moss and Paul Reeve, who wrote a very wonderful, generous prologue or epilogue to the reissue.
Yeah, Paul wrote Religion of a Different Color, and he's coming up with a new book on the 1852 legislature. Which
right, yeah.
I was talking to Paul earlier this year, and I said, can I talk to you before or after your book comes out? He told me after, and I was like, no, I wanted before.
Well, I didn't realize he was doing a whole book. I know he's been working very closely with a couple of other scholars, and the woman who who worked for the church, who was able to decipher the shorthand.
Legene Carruth.
Legene Carruth, and with a lawyer, and I can't remember his name now. Chris Rich. I know he's been working on that particular crucial period with those two scholars, so I'm not sure if this is going to be in conjunction with them or not. I thought it was just going to be an article length. I didn't realize he was doing a whole book.
A whole book. I think he's done with the book. It's to the publisher, but sometimes that review process takes a while.
Yeah.
So I believe that's correct. Hopefully that's right, Paul. So Paul, you're next. No. Well, let's dive into Harold B. Lee, his life and thought. So one of the interesting things is I think he was ordained as a 10-year-old deacon. Is that
That's correct. Right? Yeah, that's very unusual, because I didn't realize that was even within legal or within church canon, that they would allow somebody to be ordained as a 10-year-old deacon. And that was reflective of his precocity, that he was extremely bright. He stood out in terms of his intellect and his drive and just who he was.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's pretty precocious.
10-year-old deacon.
So, and it seems like he grew up in Idaho. Was it near Ezertown, Benson? I think it was. Yeah,
they were close. They lived close to one another, but they never knew each other until they got into Oneida Academy, which was sort of like the high school up there. They never really met or knew each other. But he lived in Clifton, Idaho, which is a very small town in the Upper Cache Valley. It's a pretty rugged environment up there, because it's about a 4,000-foot elevation, harsh winters, and so if you farm up there, it's a very precarious existence. And he grew up in that precarious existence. The family struggled financially, and that was something I think that stayed with Harold B. Lee, is the struggle of his own family to eke out a livelihood in that environment of. I should mention there was one other famous, noteworthy person that came out of that small town, which has never had a population more than 2,000 or 3,000, even right down to the present. It stayed pretty much the same size it was when Harold B. Lee was a boy. But interestingly enough, the other very noteworthy person to come out of that town is Tara Westover, who is the author of Educated, and she talks about her hardscrabble childhood, and her parents were kind of nutty types, and unlike Harold B. Lee's, they were almost on they were LDS, they were Mormon, but they were survivalist Mormons. They were right on the edge of the church, so to speak.
Right, yeah. That's I should get her on sometime. So yeah, that's an interesting story. Now I know it seems like Harold's father got into some financial shenanigans with the church, right?
Well, yes. I mean, it's interesting. It was almost a product of not his being, being doing anything of a malevolent nature, but almost of his generosity in terms of but also trying to survive their own financial problems. He was the bishop of the ward up there, and shortly after, about the time that Harold B. Lee came back from his mission in Colorado, his father was disfellowshipped for the misappropriation of funds, and it's unclear what exactly was involved in the misappropriation of funds, whether they took them for their, he siphoned them off for his own use. I haven't followed that up that closely, but it was a shattering experience, not just for Samuel Lee, Harold's father, but for the whole family, and it had a profound impact on Harold B. Lee, and I think it helped to reinforce in him his kind of very careful conservatism in the handling of church funds. I think that came right down into his period as apostleship, and also as president, of the church, that he didn't want to get into a situation where that was going to be a problem in the church as a whole.
Well, and I know some similar issue came up later, I think when he was a church leader, that someone had misused funds, and he was like, "Hey, look what happened to my dad. You're gonna get treated the same way." Well,
I think a lot of it had to do with the building program in the early 1960s, and it involved I'm trying to think of his name now. He was high church leader, and that's terrible. As I said, it's been a while since I wrote the book, but it was one of the Mendenhall, I think, was the head of the buildings program, and there was an apostle who was over that, a fellow apostle, whom he was junior to Harold B. Lee in terms of seniority, but he was older. He was. Isn't that terrible? I'm having this what do you call it, a brain fart. Sorry about the term, but if you knew his name, and I was just looking at it earlier, you'd know the name if you heard it, because a very prominent family in Salt Lake. They were a law family, and he died suddenly when all of this was going on. You know who I'm talking about?
I do, but I can't remember the name either.
But you would know the name immediately. Unfortunately, this book doesn't have a table of contents, so I can't refer to it very quickly. But he died in the middle of this, and I guess N. Eldon Tanner was brought in to replace him, and to clean up this mess that he had caused through he and Mendenhall.
Was it Moyle?
Moyle, Henry D. Moyle. Thank you very much. Very prominent Utah family, and very, they were among the royalty. They were very well fixed financially, and Moyle and Lee, both bright, intelligent men, but both very strong-willed. Moyle, who came out of a very privileged background, didn't have too much trouble saying, I can spend as much as I want on these things, whereas Lee, who comes out of a much more stringent background, said, hey, we're going too far. And so the church was in financial, kind of in a financial bind during the 1960s, and so they were looking for ways to try to recoup. And as I say, when Moyle died, Tanner was brought in, and he kind of ended up straightening out things, and Eldon Tanner.
Yeah, he really, because I know under McKay, the church was really in some financial difficulties because they had overspent the tithing funds and that thing with the building programs.
Yeah.
And I think Tanner kind of led us to where we've got $100 billion now today, right?
Yeah, I mean, he turned out to be a very, very efficient administrator, and one of the more effective of the church leaders who came along during this period.
Right. So one of the other interesting things was to learn about President Lee's feelings on prohibition. Can you talk about that?
Well, he was serving in politics at that time when they were lifting the the Prohibition, the 18th Amendment was in effect. And he was on the Salt Lake City Commission. And he had been appointed that position, but he had to run for a full term. He was filling out the term of somebody who had passed on and was on there by appointment. So in the 32 election, he was up for re-election. And there was, and also on the ballot, what complicated his candidacy was there was this measure to repeal the 18th Amendment, and Utah happened to be the one state left that needed the vote to lift prohibition, right. And so he was kind of placed in the position of where do you stand on this? And quite frankly, he ended up kind of finessing the issue. He didn't really come right out, I'm either for it or against it, but he did the politically expedient thing and saying that he wasn't in favor of going back to the way the saloons were before Prohibition, but he wasn't in favor. He indicated that Prohibition hadn't quite worked the way that it should, but he did it in a very nuanced way. So when he needed to be carefully political, he was able to finesse that issue and overcome opposition, because he was opposed for a full term on the Salt Lake City Commission, and I think he would have been an effective office holder, because he had the intelligence and the ability to, and the perception of doing that, because he was urged to run for governor 2 different times. In 1940, there were people urging him to run for the Republican nomination for governor, and then again in 44, after he'd been appointed to the apostleship, after he was an apostle, they wanted to try to get him to run and a delegation of leading Republicans urged him to run. But again, he declined. And then one last time in 46, again, there was a groundswell of opinion to get him, within the Republican Party, to get him to run for United States Senator, because the incumbent senator at that time, a guy named Abe Murdoch, appeared to be very vulnerable. And they thought if they got a strong enough candidate, and 46 was a year of Republican ascendancy, and that was a year that it could have happened, because and at that time, both J. Reuben Clark, who had initially told Lee to hold back in 40 and 44, Reuben Clark was saying, seemed to give the okay sign, as did David O. McKay. But the one missing person who was not there to kind of give the green light was George Albert Smith, who was president of the church at that time. And for whatever reasons, he was not, he was out of town or incapacitated or something, because he had frail health. And so he was unable to get the final approval, because he could have very well run in 46. I mean, he came so close. And that's when he was still an apostle. So the history of the church could have turned out very much differently in terms of the trajectory of his life career.
So he would have been an apostle senator just like Reed Smoot?
Well, I don't know. I guess that's a possibility, because certainly what happened prior with, like you say, with Smoot, and subsequently with Ezra Taft Benson serving concurrently as Secretary of Agriculture and still maintaining his apostleship. I guess there was precedent for that. I don't know if he would have. That would have been an interesting situation, because it would have been a replication of what Smoot had done some 40 years earlier.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of his big accomplishments before he became an apostle was with the welfare system. Can you talk about what happened there? Well,
that was came out of the distress of the Great Depression and the strong anti-New Deal attitudes that existed within the within the leadership of the church on the part of J. Reuben Clark and
why were they so against the New Deal?
Well, they felt like it was too much government intervention. There was always this within the church. There's always been this kind of leeriness about too much government overreach. You know, a lot of that I think goes back to when the anti-polygamy things that went on in the late 19th century. They were just always very leery of you know, interventionist federal government, and they felt that the New Deal program was encouraging people to not you know, to not take advantage of their own initiative and laziness and so on, and they felt that you know, it was too much like a dole, just giving them, paying for not doing anything, and you know, there's always been that strong that well, I guess you could say socialism or too much just too much government giving people, destroying people's self-initiative to go out there and do something for themselves. And so the welfare program was an attempt to take that away from the federal government, you know, the idea of relief, but they would the people would play a role in their own relief, because what was set up, it was based on taking the foundation was agriculture, that they would take the agricultural crops and process them, you know, set up their own plants or bottling, you know, canning factories and stuff like that, to take agricultural produce and then make it available, so people would be involved within the church, would be involved in it would give them work, and it would take this surplus, because there's a lot of agricultural surplus out there, and make it available to those who needed it. And so that was the basis, was you take these the agricultural surplus, make it into food and other commodities, and then along that they also created, you know, making clothing and so on, and also involved in building and that. And so and the people that would be involved, they would provide employment, and then they would also benefit from what was being produced. Whereas at this very time, the New Deal, they were actually destroying agricultural crops through this through the relief, through the programs that are being set up, because they said the federal government was saying, we're going to destroy these crops so that the prices will go up, because the prices for farm commodities was so low, and you had a surplus. And so they kind of had the opposite approach. Instead of taking the commodities and destroy them within the church welfare program, they were taking those surplus commodities and producing them and distributing them to members within the church. So it made a lot of common sense, the way the program, the rationale for the program, but it helped a good number of people within the church. So there was a degree of success, but the irony is the majority of Latter-day Saints continued to be involved in New Deal programs. It wasn't just, you know, the agricultural commodities program, but in various work projects programs that were going on, you know, roads and bridges and other types of. A lot of people were involved in including Latter-day Saints, a good percentage of Latter-day Saints, and so it was a mixed success in terms of getting people away from government, you know, relief, so to speak.
Yeah. So he was really recognized for this welfare program,
he was
right?
national. He became a national figure, and that's what kind of propelled him into the limelight, both within the church hierarchy, where they saw him as a future church leader, and within the secular political community, who wanted to see him run for public office. So, I mean, his whole setting up of the church welfare program, which started out in his stake. He started out in the Pioneer Stake with a local stake centered relief program, upon which was the template on which the church-wide program was set up.
Were there any people within the church that were opposed to anything?
Oh yes, there were. I mean, there were several people, including Stephen A. Richards, and a guy named Sylvester Cannon, who, interestingly enough, was the presiding bishop, because I think he clearly saw it as kind of an invasion of his bailiwick, because the presiding bishop was over, food distribution and that type of thing within the church itself. So I think it was a turf battle on the part of Sylvester Cannon, but the big proponent who was supporting Lee in it was, of course, J. Reuben Clark. He became. That's an interesting story in and of itself, because Clark was Lee's mentor. I mean, Lee looked to Clark as a father figure, both emotionally as well as spiritually in every way, kind of replacing his disgraced father, with whom, after all of this stuff happened up in Idaho, really was a broken man. I mean, he
was never able to get over that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, poor Samuel Lee. I mean, he ended up being a night watchman at ZCMI, and he just a sad figure, sad figure.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about Lee and Clark's interactions together?
Yes, as I say, it was very much of like a father-son relationship. I mean, Clark was supporting Lee in everything that he did in the welfare program. Initially, he was a strong proponent, and he was the one that got him put on the 12. I mean, he was the primary driving force in getting this young whippersnapper, who was only 41 years old, when he was ordained to the 12 in 1942.
That's really young.
And I mean, that is really young. So it was Clark's initiative that said, this man's going to be, he's going to be it. Because I'm sure at the time he was calculating that being put on there as so much younger than any of the apostles, he was going to be a future church president, because he was some 22 years younger than the next youngest guy on the 12 when he went on, who was Sylvester Cannon, the guy that had opposed him. Is kind of interesting. They took old Sylvester. He came from a very prominent family, the Cannon family, and Sylvester Cannon was sort of pushed off as eased out as presiding bishop, and then they found a vacancy on the 12 to put him on, and so he was the second most junior apostle when Lee was appointed, at age 41.
Yeah.
And he was in his 60s.
Right. So it's interesting. I know one of the things that really struck me, there was an attempt within President McKay's administration to send some missionaries to Nigeria, and Lee opposed that.
Yes, very much so. As I said, the thing that I found the most problematic, in my opinion, about Lee was his attitudes on race. I mean, it conformed with his basic conservatism, his neo-orthodoxy and his conservatism. He wasn't a blatant, outright racist like some of the people that were really into the racist theology. He said his piece on the race issue in Youth of a Noble Birthright, which was published in a book, which was originally a radio speech that he gave in 1945, and subsequently published in a book, Youth in the Church. And he defended the traditional, arguments that they had been less valued in the pre-existence. They were an accursed, dark-skinned race. I mean, he went along with all of those arguments, but he didn't state them over and over and over again the way that people like President Joseph Fielding Smith did, who was the leading theologian who really articulated and made him up to a fine, sharp point, or like his son-in-law Bruce R. McConkie, who proclaimed it Mormon doctrine in that in the work that was published and in 1959, or people like Alvin R. Dwyer, or Mark E. Peterson. I guess Mark E. Peterson gave one of the most, pointed arguments, but Lee was not that way. I mean, he was steadfast in his belief that blacks were not worthy to receive the priesthood, and until the Lord spoke, that was going to be the doctrine of the church. It would take the Lord speaking loud and clear to make it clear that the ban was to be lifted. And he had no inspiration whatsoever that the Lord was speaking loud and clear to him to lift the ban. And that was irrevocable right up until the time of his death. As I pointed out in that letter that he writes to Hugh B. Brown's daughter, concerning Hugh B. Brown's granddaughter, who had married a black man. And it's interesting because her name is Jorgensen, Rilla Jorgensen. She's writing Lee saying, gosh, my son-in-law is just so distraught over, he feels like he's part of an accursed race. He's not even worthy to be a Latter-day Saint, and he refuses to be baptized into the church. And Lee responds to that. This is 3 months before his death. And Lee responds to that letter by not just completely ignoring the anguish of this young man and proceeding to lecture Hugh Brown's daughter on that the ban, on the justification for the ban. He makes no reference at all to the anguish or the feelings of this young man, because he is so adamantly opposed to, and he's already doubled down on the legitimacy of the ban in the wake of Stephen L. Taggart's book, which came out in the late 60s, and Lester Bush's article. He has doubled down that the ban is fixed doctrine. There's no question in his mind, and I'm not saying in his defense, but as a counter argument, I think it's part of his overall belief in the orthodoxy of Mormon doctrine, conservative orthodoxy of Mormon doctrine and practices in general. It's not because of I don't see him as a blatant racist per se. I just see him as fixed because this is the way the church has operated since going back to the mid-19th century.
Well, and it seems like he and Hugh B. Brown did a lot of battles in the 1960s, especially because I know Brown as early as 1962 was trying to overturn the ban.
and he was. I mean, it was interesting because their relationship initially was very congenial. They worked together back during World War II. They were on the Servicemen's Committee, working with LDS servicemen serving during World War II. And in fact, Lee was so impressed with working with Brown, as saying he's done such a great job. I just hope he gets to be an apostle. I mean, this was back in the 40s, and so at that period of time, and they had a very congenial relationship, but they broke with one another over the race issue, and that came later. That came in the 1960s when Brown was pushing to lift the ban. And Lee was just the opposite, saying it's got to stay in place, it's fixed doctrine.
Was Brown junior to Lee then?
Yes, he was. In seniority, because Brown wasn't even ordained an apostle. I think it was in the late 50s, I think 57, 58. And so Lee had been, had been one of the 12 since the early 40s. And so he was by far a junior apostle. But the interesting thing is, McKay elevated him shortly after he'd been ordained apostle, elevated him to the first presidency in the early 1960s when they, and so in terms of the lines of authority, it looked like the Brown was the senior figure because now he was a counselor in the first presidency, and so Brown felt that he had the clout that he could push forward with his agenda to give blacks the priesthood, and so whereas Lee looked at him and could say, didn't say directly to him, but he's coming at it from, I'm a senior apostle to him, and so that's one of the reasons why he was dropped from the first presidency after the death of David O. McKay in 1970. And when under the presidency of Joseph Fielding Smith, the supreme irony is that when the first presidency is reorganized, Brown is dropped as first counselor, and Lee,
death, right?
After his death, and Lee is installed as first counselor in the place of Brown. So, I mean, he's kind of taken over that position, and so, the ban's not going to be lifted, and already they've in '69 they've issued the reaffirmation that it's fixed doctrine.
Yeah.
And with the first presidency statement, which curiously enough was not signed by David O. McKay, but it was signed by the two counselors, N. Eldon Tanner and Hubie Brown.
December of '69?
It was signed. The statement. Yeah.
McKay died in January. Right?
The statement comes out just before his death. The statement. It's a curious timing because he is so feeble. President McKay is so feeble, he's unable to sign the statement. It's only signed by the two counselors. And it's one of those situations where Brown is compelled to affix his signature to this. This is the ultimate humiliation, that he's forced. It's sort of like something out of The Godfather. Either your signature or your brains are going to be on this document. I mean, it's not. Maybe that's saying it a little bit crudely, but it kind of says almost the same thing. And so Brown feels compelled to affix his signature to this document they absolutely detest,
right,
because to maintain unity within the church.
Well, and I know Matt's coming out with his new book on all of that.
He's got a lot more to say about that than I do.
I know. I cannot wait. And actually, he said a lot on my podcast a few years ago, so you'll definitely want to check that out, because the whole Lee-Brown dynamics is just fascinating.
And Brown is absolutely devastated by in retrospect, and he never lives to see the ban lifted,
right,
because he dies in 74, 75, I think, and it's, as I say, it's a sad story. And as I say, the double irony is a situation involving his granddaughter.
Exactly.
That's the supreme irony. I mean, that's one of the things that's always fascinated me about church history, are the ironies and the twists and turns.
I mean, I don't know how to say this, but does it seem like Lee was really heartless, especially with Brown?
Well, he was adamant. I don't know. On that point, I think he was very much inflexible on the race issue. There's no doubt in my mind, if he had lived a normal lifespan, if he had lived, of a church leader into his 90s, he was only in his early 70s when he died. If he'd have lived 20 more years, we could still be stuck with the ban.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty convinced of that. I don't know. As I say, we can't predict the future, but he was pretty adamant about that. As I say, right up until his death. I mean, reflective, and that was a real find for me. I discovered that letter, that exchange between Lee and Hubie Brown's daughter. It was in the papers of his personal papers, which I had access to, which nobody had ever seen that document.
And what did the document say?
Well, as I say, it was a personal correspondence between, there were two letters. One,
him and
from the daughter to Lee, saying my son-in-law, my African-American son-in-law, is very distraught about the black issue and about his status in the church. He refuses to join the church because he feels like he's unworthy. He feels like he's an accursed race.
Do you see a parallel with LGBT issues today?
Oh boy, that's a quagmire, isn't it? It's a real quagmire. I have a gay brother. In fact, my brother who I just took to the airport. And I've seen him. I saw him struggle through the course of his life over that issue, and finally to the point where he's able to resolve he's in a very loving relationship. They're married in Alabama, of all places.
Oh wow!
And he struggled for many years. Struggled with that issue. He wasn't a particularly active, believing Latter-day Saint because he's extremely bright and articulate like me. He asked too many questions, and so really he never, by the time he was in his teenage years, he was not involved in the church, but there was always that element of, somehow the way the church has handled it. I mean, like Harold B. Lee considered it an abomination, an awful thing. He had some pretty nasty things, I guess we'd call them today, to say about homosexuality in conformity with his conservative views. And I feel the church is really in a very difficult position on that issue, unlike the black issue, where there are clear evidence that blacks were indeed ordained and to the priesthood in the early church. As far as the LGBTQ issue, it runs counter to basic Mormon Latter-day Saint theology, the concept of how they view the eternal concept of family. The whole idea of same-sex dynamics or same-sex relationships being carried into the eternities. That just not, it's so counter to the way that the overall Mormon theology is set up, the eternal nature of families, the propagation of additional souls in the hereafter, and all of that. Eternal progression. It runs counter to what is essential Mormon theology, and so I have a very hard time seeing how the church is going to resolve that conundrum. But that's just me. I'm an inactive, non-practicing Latter-day Saint, somewhat of an outside observer. So there might be other dynamics going on among church leaders, which I'm not privy to. But I really don't see it as really anything that's going to happen in the near future. And I would say likewise, that's probably true with the idea of ordaining women. Only maybe that's less so, because again, it runs counter to the basic patriarchy of the way the church is structured. I mean, we've gotten so used to it's run by men. It's been run by men from the very beginning. I tend to disagree with with Mike Quinn, who claimed that women were ordained to the church, which got him excommunicated.
Right.
I tend to question that, because the evidence to that seems, it doesn't seem convincing enough to me. And he got excommunicated specifically, I guess, for that article, and it seems like, to me, it seemed like it was kind of a frail argument. I thought, I'm sure he was excommunicated more for the overall body of his work and for the fact that it was clear that he was gay.
Well, and Margaret Toscano makes a claim that the Relief Society was a priesthood quorum. So you don't see it that way either?
Well, I would see it maybe as an auxiliary priesthood of priestesses, but they don't have the same degree of authority or clout. I mean, how would it fit in with the overall structure of church leadership? A Relief Society quorum of priestesses. In studying the evolving structure of the church, how the organizational structure evolved, I wonder how that would fit within the overall structure of the church, the way that it was developed. 35, when you start, you have the major changes, the setting up of the Quorum of the 12, First Presidency, and the 70s, and then getting to the end of Joseph's life. It could have moved in that direction, perhaps, because he had already established the idea of being a king. The idea of the kingdom of God, and he'd established the quorum of the anointed. But it seems like he was establishing a number of new, right at the end of his life, a number of new institutions or structural institutions. And so the structure of the church was becoming more complex by the end of his life. And I found that very intriguing. That the idea that the Relief Society, is they are priestesses, kind of fits in with what he's doing with these other aspects of the church. So maybe eventually it would have evolved into, women would have had more of a role in the actual running of the church, and driven in part maybe by polygamy. I don't know. I mean, I've always found one of the most intriguing questions in studying church history, the very end of Joseph Smith's life. If Joseph Smith had not been assassinated, how would the structure of the church had evolved subsequently? Because so many interesting things were happening right at the end of Joseph's life.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So, I mean, this is kind of off the topic of Harold B. Lee, but
we got off a little bit.
Let's go there. Because, I was at the fair conference, I told you yesterday, and, there was a woman, I wish I could remember her name, that spoke about a kingdom of priests and priestesses, and she was quoting Jonathan Stapley's article about women used to give blessings.
Right.
And Joseph said, what's the harm? If people are healed, it's God obviously accepts it.
Well,
and we've taken that lasted up through about the 1940s, 50s.
Right, yeah, I think, right.
I don't see why that couldn't come back. And I know Quinn and Margaret Toscano both say, you know what? I mean, Margaret basically says, by virtue of the endowment, women have priesthood.
Yes.
And
yes, I agree.
This woman that spoke yesterday, I think she was quoting Jonathan Stapley, said that just a woman's baptism gives her a form of authority, which I thought was very interesting. And I know Quinn said if the president of the priesthood, who is currently President Nelson, he could make a proclamation and say, yes, women can be bishops or women can be apostles or whatever. Like, it's his decision as president of the priesthood.
Well, that sounds like a nice, good argument, and I consider myself very much a person who would favor women having the priesthood, because I think women are every bit as capable, in some ways more capable, of making leadership decisions. And I think that would have been more of a possibility at Joseph Smith's time because of all the other changes he was making in terms of leadership. But the way the leadership of the church is today, it's been so fixed and so structured. And actually, I think a counter-argument can be made that the church has actually moved more and more in the opposite direction. They've taken away women's empowerment in a lot of ways. I mean, the correlation was, what Lee was responsible for in correlation, in many ways, took away from women the authority to make budgetary decisions, the authority to publish their own journals and other publications. And part of the correlation thing was placing these auxiliaries, the women-dominated auxiliaries like the primary, the Young Women's MIA, and the Relief Society directly under priesthood authority. And that because Lee's intention, it wasn't because he was a misogynist, it's because he wanted greater efficiency, and the church has moved in this direction of driven from the top authority. And I guess the argument against, so it's a lot less likely today. I contend it's a lot less likely today than that would have been at Joseph Smith's time, when the leadership structure was still and the organizational structure of the church was still in more of a state of flux. Because after his death, things became much more structured. Because otherwise, people were confused about where is Joseph Smith taking the church. That's why there was so much fragmentation after Joseph's death. And so immediately after Brigham Young comes in, I argue this in my Brigham Young biography, he's very much determined to make sure things are structured. He clips the wings of the Relief Society initially, Whereas,
Gets rid of the quorum.
Exactly. And under correlation, I would argue that Harold B. Lee and correlation were doing the same thing by making the leadership or the structure of the church much more top down, because as the church has grown internationally, and that has become an absolute priority if you're going to keep maintain the uniformity and the structure of the teachings and so on. I have a hard time seeing the church moving toward giving women offices in the priesthood. They might say, well, maybe we'll call the religious society, maybe we'll go back to what during Joseph's time, we'll say they're priestesses and all of that. But I don't see that very likely either, because if you look at the demographics of the church, where they're enjoying the greatest growth is in those countries outside the United States, where the members tend to be more conservative and more orthodox, more willing to follow the dictates of the top-down leadership. And so I hate to sound like I'm a pessimist, but I would tend to question whether that is in the offing. I could be wrong.
Let me throw something at you that President Nelson has done, because I do think this has been a relatively big change. I know that with baptisms now, it doesn't have to be a man that witnesses the baptisms. And I was with my son at the temple recently, and women can be witnesses, and so that's been a recent change that has kind of expanded women's role in the temple, or even at a live baptism, not in the temple. So it does seem like President Nelson's kind of expanding a little bit. Comments on that?
Yeah, well, I agree. They're trying to give women more of a role in the performance of these, like you say, in performance of ordinances and stuff like that, and even in the running of of particular wards or congregations. I guess they have don't they have a structure where they bring in the women in what they call what they call it, where there's the bishopric and
PEC, Priesthood Executive Council.
Doesn't each ward have kind of an executive council,
right,
where women are included?
Young women are
where women are included in that. So I think the church,
ward council, I guess.
Ward council, and that's something that's different, that hasn't existed before. So I think that there's a movement to try to give women more of a voice. I mean, there's a difference between giving women more of a voice and giving them the authority to perform ordinances. I think that's a tougher nut to crack. I think the church has become very conscious of giving women more of a voice, including them in conference talks and so on, because they're sensitive to the fact that of what's been going on in the larger society, where women have gotten to be more and more involved in the larger secular society, and running corporations and in the leadership positions in other churches, and in all in politics. We're a society where we're really driven by gender equality, and so I think these are attempts to try to give some of that sense of a greater participation. But when the rubber hits the road, would they have the authority to act in the position of being a bishop or a counselor, in contrast to what you have in the community of Christ?
And Quinn says all that has to happen is President Nelson says, now they can be a bishop.
but what would the rest of the leadership go along with that? I mean, somebody like, I see when Nelson departs the scene, that the next leader of the church is going to be Dallin Oaks, and I see him as a much more orthodox, kind of a more stricter by numbers guy than Nelson is. It's ironic, because I think there's about 10 years between Oaks and Nelson, and I used to think that Oaks might be the more liberal when he first went on to 12, because I followed his career very, very closely, because I think I may have told you this.
You can tell us again, people.
No, they don't want to hear it again, do they? No, not again. No, not again. I dated Dallin Oakes's sister-in-law when I was in college. At that time, he was a professor at the University of Chicago before he became BYU president. He was married to the older sister, June Dixon, and I was dating Linda Dixon. It was a summer romance, and you know, as I tell people, when Dallin Oakes was elevated to the 12, and he'd come in after Wilkinson as president of BYU, and seemed to be a breath of fresh air after the Wilkinson regime, and seemed to be more. And he'd also co-authored a book. He had training as a historian. He'd co-authored a very definitive study with Marvin Hill called Carthy's Conspiracy. So he had experience as a historian, and that it was it was a fairly open-minded book. And so I thought that, gosh, this guy's, he's coming in as a fairly young age.
Well, and he helped with dialogue, too.
Yeah, he was on, I mean, all of this seemed to indicate that perhaps he's going to be, a more moderate, maybe not a liberal voice, but a more moderate, more like a Hugh B. Brown, maybe, or something like that. And actually what has happened is he's moved more and more to the other direction, and that's kind of an interesting story in of itself, what has pushed him in that other direction. And I think it's the demographics of the church. As I say, the church is enjoying its strongest growth in those parts of the world where the people that are joining tend to be more conservative. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the fact he's moving more and more to the right is driven by church demographics, which is, it makes it tough for American Latter-day Saints,
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't mean to get off on that.
That's okay. We do tangents here, so it's fine.
A little bit of a tangent from a tangent.
Well, let's jump back to Harold B. Lee. There was a story about Ervil LeBaron. What can you tell us about Ervil LeBaron?
Well, there was an apparent death threat because Ervil LeBaron was involved in the killing of Reuel Allred in 1978. So he was kind of a loose nut anyway. And so there was fear that perhaps
LeBaron was a polygamist, right?
Down in Mexico, and they kind of a violent character, and so there was a threat. There was a perceived threat that he, and this, I guess this had been before Allred, because Allred wasn't killed until 1978, and Harold B. Lee, had been dead for quite a while. But this was, a threat which was taken seriously, and it didn't amount to anything. I just mentioned it in passing in my book. What it did is it forced the church to tighten up its security in the church office buildings and stuff like that, and people just couldn't walk in.
Because LeBaron had a hit out on, I know, President Kimball. Was it maybe on Harold B. Lee as well?
Yeah. As I recall, as I say, I didn't go into a lot of detail because I didn't have a lot of information on that incident. But the upshot was that it compelled a tightening of church security.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other things that I thought was very interesting, in fact, I think Matt Harris just mentioned this recently at MHA, but it was in this book as well, was that President Lee had purchased land for the Brazil Temple. Right before his death.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting because, according to Matt Harris, that temple was instrumental.
Yes, that's true.
In overturning the ban because Brazil was full of interracial.
That's
couples.
right. Yeah, and I think it was part of the international expansion of the church. I don't know if President Lee, agonized over what the racial implications are of that. It'd be nice to have access to the to his presidential papers and the official correspondence that was going on back and forth. Whether that was a topic that came up, but it was nowhere mentioned in the sources that he contemplated that they'd have to face a problem of race. although he himself, as he traveled, as I talk about in the book, he encountered several instances of where the position and the status of blacks came up, visiting South America, visiting South Africa, but he didn't. He did seem to contemplate, well, gosh, maybe we ought to consider lifting the ban because we are, he does encounter, instances of blacks and their status in the church, but he never really elevates it to the level where he's agonized over that the way that Spencer W. Kimball, his successor, is, or that Hugh B. Brown was before him. As I say, I think part of it is just he was so focused on maintaining the orthodoxy of Mormon beliefs and practices, and maybe saw this as, if the ban is lifted, how's that going to affect other doctrines and other practices within the church itself? And if his papers were available, we could that issue could be elucidated in greater detail, or if the correspondence that others received, that would be available, because he corresponded with lower level mission presidents and so on, and that's going to be a task for another historian who does. Because, as I say, this is far from a definitive biography. This is an overview. But the real definitive, full-bodied biography on Harold B. Lee remains to be seen. Mine is just an overview to try to give a sense of what his significance and importance in the church was, which I didn't think that the previous biographies by Gibbons and by his son-in-law Goetz, I don't think they elucidated fully to what his impact and significance were, and that's where I feel, even though as thin as my volume is, it does that more thoroughly. But as I indicate, it's a much more nuanced, it's a much more detailed story, and those documents, unfortunately, are not available.
Yeah. Hopefully Matt can get his hands on it.
Well, Matt has done a great job in getting hold of this stuff.
Oh, I know.
On Hugh B. Brown. He has gone a lot further than I ever dreamed of going in his biography of Hugh B. Brown than I ever had any intention of going to in my little Harold B. Lee.
Well, it's the one question that nobody can answer. I know they can answer, but, because you just talked about how Lee was very, adamant about the ban with Hugh B. Brown's granddaughter, and then, but then he buys land that turns out to be the temple. So I'm wondering,
that's a good question.
Did President Kimball repurpose that? Did Lee have other ideas for that land, or I don't?
Well, I mean, they were going to build a temple. But I guess he figured maybe they could continue to do what they'd done in the past, continue to try to avoid baptizing and proselytizing to people that were of questionable lineage. That I don't think he envisioned how the growth of the church would explode in Brazil, because I think Brazil today has the third largest total membership in the entire church. I think I'm correct on that. I think Mexico is next, and I think Brazil is third. I could be wrong. I haven't seen the exact demographics on that, but I know, I don't think anybody anticipated that the church would grow as fast and rapidly and drive the need to lift the ban in 78. And because that would have been, Lee dies in 74, and the temple, the ban is lifted in 78, and I just wonder if Lee really anticipated that the growth would be in the direction that it was, because up to that time they had been very careful in making sure they could trace the lineage outside the country.
Well, and then the whole issue back in 65 with Nigeria, and Lee was adamantly opposed to even sending missionaries there.
He could see that it opened a whole Pandora's box, because the whole issue there was who's going to supervise and run these congregations. Are they're going to have to keep sending whites down there to run these congregations? And Lee could see that unlike Brazil, where you have more of a mixed population and could rely more on native membership. You couldn't do that in Nigeria because it's almost entirely an black African nation.
Right.
And so I think that's why he was so, because he say this is going to open up the need to give him the priesthood, and he didn't want that at all.
But so it's interesting because you say he wasn't your classic racist.
No, not in the same category as Bruce R. McConkie or Mark E. Peterson or even Joseph Fielding Smith, who really had this myopic view of race as a doctrine within the church.
Lee was just more of an institutionalist. This is the
Yeah,
way we've
I'd
done
say
things, and we're going to keep doing them the same way.
Yeah, and maintain the orthodoxy of practices and beliefs. Because he would have had, I think he would have said a lot more on the race issue, because I would even include in that more racist category Ezra Taft Benson, because the scary thing is if Lee, the successor after Lee, because Kimball was in questionable health. I mean,
right.
he'd had all of this heart surgery, he'd had cancer, throat cancer, and Kimball was sure that he was going to predecease Lee. And if that had been the case, Lee had lived on for another 5-10 years. Ezra Taft Benson would have become president of the church. And there's no way on God's earth that Benson, I mean, given his attitudes and behavior with regard to race, that Benson would have lifted the ban.
But it is interesting to me that Benson was the one who called the first black general authority Helvecio Martins. Yeah,
well, by that time the ban had been lifted.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't lift the ban,
right.
But the ban had been lifted, and now it was church, is part of the church canon.
I wonder how much Hinckley and Monson had to do with that. Any ideas?
I don't know. I mean, Benson, Matt has done the definitive work on Benson as well, and Benson was he was a whole different breed of animal. His ideology was driven by this strong conspiratorial John Birch ideology. That, I mean, the whole family, including his 2 sons and wife, were members of the John Birch Society, and Benson himself was a strong sympathizer, and he even, with Benson, as you're aware, he wanted to run on the racist 1968 American Independent Party ticket with George Wallace,
right.
And he kept on trying to get permission from David O. McKay to do that. So that tells you where he stands on race. The fact that he's willing to run with a blatant racist on a third party ticket in 68, and even before that, they tried to form their own very ultra-conservative John Birch political party called the 76, the Spirit of 76 Party, where he would be the presidential candidate, and Strom Thurmond, an absolute hardcore segregationist, would be his vice presidential running mate. So, as I say, if Lee hadn't, if Lee had lived, a few more years, and let's say Spencer W. Kimball had died, sooner, than Lee,
or even if he lived through to 85 when Kimball did die, Benson was next.
Yeah, he was next, and he was in there until 90.
Right.
And so who comes after?
Then Hunter.
Yeah, Hunter comes after Benson, and I mean, it would. I feel it would take another 10, 15, 20 years if the church was going to move in that direction, and it wouldn't have been under either Lee or Benson. It wouldn't have been under either one of those.
You talk more about Benson because you and Craig Foster have the book on
the American Presidency, Quest of the American Presidency.
Right.
Yeah.
So if people want to check that out.
Yeah, that's where we got into Benson, and I did a subsequent article on Benson that was part of Matt Harris's anthology. Matt did two works. He did the more narrative history overview, and then he did an anthology. And I've got an essay in there that I updated.
Thunder from the Right.
Yeah, Thunder from the Right. I've got an essay in there which I found additional information showing how closely linked Benson was to the John Birch Society. And how he was so politically ambitious. He wanted to be president of the United States. There's no question about it. And that's the argument because I found more evidence to support how hard driven he was in his. He had what I call Potomac fever.
All right. Well, one last thing I thought I would talk about before I let you go, and this isn't really so much to do with Lee, but I found it interesting, was Marky Peterson wanted Lester Bush excommunicated. Can you tell us more about that story?
Well, I don't know a lot of detail in it. As I say, it was just a passing thing, and I guess it was J. Willard Marriott who was the president of the stake in which Lester Bush was a member, and I guess he resisted doing that. I guess. And I guess he was able to survive. I mean, J. Willard Marriott, pretty prominent guy,
Right.
And money talks, and I think influence, and because he was much more influential than Marky Peterson, who is a Mormon apostle who outside of Utah and the Mormon Church has heard of Marky Peterson. So I think that Marriott was wise enough to resist doing that. From what I've been able, I don't have a lot of information on that, but that's the kind of the conclusion I've come to. And but as part of the anger that was felt toward Lester Bush's wonderfully researched essay that really opened up the whole. It influenced my scholarship. I really owe him a debt of great gratitude for, and it's sad because he was a practicing, active Latter-day Saint, and all that Lester Bush was trying to do in his, if you read his article very carefully, he was trying to get the church to acknowledge that the black priesthood ban was not linked to essential Mormon practices or doctrine. I mean, the way he wrote that article, he downplays the ideas that I developed in my own study, that there was an element of racial identity, ethnic whiteness and all of that Paul Reeve has subsequently built on, and that other scholars have built on. But what Lester Bush did in his article, he downplays the fact, he said, well, this idea of black priesthood denial was never really a part of essential Mormon doctrine or belief, because what's notably omitted from Lester Bush's article, no mention whatsoever of the ideas in the Book of Mormon of darkness, of blackness being a divine curse. And that was the elephant in the room that he never acknowledged in his study. And I felt, if you're going to talk about the development of Mormon racial attitudes toward blacks, you got to talk about what racial attitudes were toward American Indians, because there's an overlap there. And he didn't mention the Book of Mormon at all. And that was part of his larger scheme, because he felt if he could leave out the Book of Mormon and de-emphasize some of the racist statements that were made by early church leaders and say, well, they were their opinions, they really didn't reflect essential church doctrines.
Did that save him from excommunication?
There was Lester Bush's modus operandi, which he was trying to do. It's kind of nuanced in his article. He felt if they read that, they'll realize that they can lift the ban and it won't violate essential Mormon doctrines or practices. That was his agenda. He wanted to get the church to lift the ban by acknowledging, well, for one thing, it started by Brigham Young, and that Joseph Smith had ordained these early, at least 1-2 early blacks, and that Joseph Smith, statements really did. There was no evidence at all that he said that blacks could not hold the priesthood. There was no evidence whatsoever. and he felt that the church had an out, that it, and so I think he was absolutely shocked and floored when the reaction was just the opposite on the part of Harold Lee and other church leaders. And Harold Lee immediately has his god-awful essay that he'd written back in 1945, "Birthright of a noble
youth of a noble
youth of a noble birthright," republished in a volume that was issued right after Bush's book came out.
That was in 73?
Yeah, early 73. I guess early 73. The year that he died, because he died in December. Yeah.
Yeah, and can you talk about his death and what led up to his death? Because it sounds like he had a lot of health problems.
Oh, yes. I mean...
that weren't well known at the time.
I refer that he perhaps suffered from what I would call the JFK syndrome, that he appeared to look a lot healthier and vigorous than he really was. Because throughout his life, he continued to have various health problems, and part of those were the result of whatever ailments that he had inherent, but also that he was so hard driven that he had to be doing stuff all the time. He was very devoted to his callings and so on, and he drove himself to the point where it complicated his health problems even further. So he continued to have problems with ulcers, with various other ailments, and so it was, so even up to the time of his death, he appeared to be, he appeared to be a lot healthier than he really was. And people kept telling him, "You need to slow down. You're endangering your health." Various people around him. I talk about that in the book. And he refused to. He says, I've got to do what I've got to do. I've only got so much time to do it. I mean, that he was just a hard-driven individual, and that's why he was so accomplished, was because he was pushing himself to the max all the time, and finally caught up with him when he was, I guess it was major heart failure. He'd had close calls before. A number of close calls, which I describe in the book itself, because I think the health issue was really something that was mentioned in the earlier biographies, but I think it was more of a problem throughout his life than is generally acknowledged, and you could say that he virtually wore out his body by the time he was in his early 70s, and the final illness that took him in a matter of hours. I mean, it was day after Christmas. They rush him to the hospital, and he's gone within hours. It's such a shock because, he's only in his early 70s. The youngest, he when he died, he was the youngest prophet since Joseph Smith.
Well, what are your final thoughts? Because I know you said you approached this with some trepidation, and did you learn to like Brother Lee, or?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that I got to like him any better, I'll put it that way, but I learned to have greater respect for who he was, what he did, and what he accomplished as a seminal church leader that made the church what it is today, whether for better or for worse. I think a lot of the conservatism, the orthodoxy, and everything else, he perpetuated through his successors, through his protégés like Boyd K. Packer is probably a prominent example. He perpetuated a more conservative Mormonism and a more efficient Mormonism in terms through the correlation. Those are the two things that I think are his lasting legacy today, is that the church is more conservative in enforcing, kind of a greater conformity of beliefs and practices. Because when I was growing up, in the 50s during the McKay era, there was more latitude, more willingness to allow for arguments of debate and discussion on controversial aspects of church doctrines and practices, whereas today, that is not within the realm of discussion. You go to your meetings and they give you a set liturgy, and you don't have that same openness. And part of it's because of the autonomy of the auxiliaries. I remember my mother, as a Relief Society president, preparing lessons on theology and doctrine that were discussed and debated in her Relief Society classes, and you don't have that today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's a much more regimented. I think I'll sum it up by quoting. I guess it's Armin Moss, one of my favorite people. Mm-hmm. He goes on to say that correlation tightened the screws on a potentially errant membership. Centralized control, and I'm quoting Armand here, the major aim of the correlation movement caused many church members to question whether there was any room for tolerance and autonomy. While correlation was originally intended to eliminate duplicate and inefficient programs, it ultimately produced a standardized and sanitized, and I'm quoting here, this is not me, a sanitized international instructional curriculum in which the intellectual threat was being contained by eliminating intellectual inquiry from church education, unquote.
That's what Armin Moss said.
Yep, that's not me, that's Armin Moss.
Mm-hmm. It's so sad he's gone. I wish I could have gotten him on the podcast. So. Well, great. Well, what other projects are you working on, Newell?
Well, currently I'm working on family. I'm working on an updated study of Eldridge Cleaver. That's one of the things I'm working on. I gave a paper at MHA. I discovered an unpublished autobiography that Cleaver started to write after he became involved with the church in the early 1980s. And it gives a very detailed account of how he, what drew him to the LDS Church, which I found to be something that was absolutely, to me it was a mind bender. Yeah. And so I want to do more on how he got involved with the church. He got very involved with W. Cleon Skousen through the Friedman Institute, and he got, it started out as he became. It was through personal contacts and interactions with people who made him feel more than welcome. And so that was what initially drew him in the church. And I'm working on that project. I also, for Sunstone, I did an I got interested with Craig Foster in looking at my family's involvement with plural marriage. And I found, when I was growing up, my family didn't talk at all about it. I didn't realize that they'd even practiced polygamy. But as I delved into my family history, which go back to pioneer roots, go all the way back to Joseph Smith, I found that on both sides of my family, they were deeply involved in plural marriage, and even in post-manifesto plural marriage.
Oh, wow.
I found that this one relative of mine, a great aunt, the older sister, or the younger, I guess she was an older sister, I think. She was an older sister of my grandfather, from my grandfather's side. Great aunt got involved in a post-manifesto polygamous relationship with a guy named Heber Benyon. Heber Benyon, at the time that he took my aunt as a post-manifesto wife, wow, in 1901, was bishop of the Taylorsville Ward, an office which he'd held for some 20 years. Kind of a major thing. I thought, wow, how could he be bishop? And they did it secretly without telling the children of his first family. I think his first wife knew. And ironically enough, this first wife was the sister of her sister. This first wife, Benyon's first wife, was the sister of President Heber J. Grant's wife. That was Heber J. So this Heber Benyon and President Grant were brother-in-laws when he was taken my great aunt.
Wow.
I mean, it's a fascinating story.
Grant was the one who wanted to stamp this out.
Yeah, and that is the very time that Grant, that he hadn't become president of the church yet. That when he commenced this relationship, because he became president, I think it was 1918 when Grant became president of the church. But anyway, so this Benyon, to keep it secret, he takes my great aunt and they move around quite a bit. Various communities, Lehigh, they live in Lehigh. They live up in Box Elder County, and so he's moving this family has 7 children with my great aunt.
Wow.
And she was at the time he was 43 and she was just 21.
Oh my goodness.
And so in the process, I discovered all this and just sort of blew me away. And it kind of an interesting family, because this great aunt, her younger brother in this same family was named Samuel Bringhurst, and he was president of the Swiss mission and helped to became the first president of the Swiss temple. He was the very devout, active Latter-day Saint. Mm-hmm. And in this same family, so I've got Samuel Bringhurst, I've got Mamie, her name's Mamie, the one that's married to Benyon, and then there's another brother who becomes a career criminal. He's ultimately gets involved in a shootout in California and is executed at San Quentin for killing this policeman in 1924. This all comes out of the same family. And my grandfather was he was pretty much of a conventional person. He was just an average, hardworking Latter-day Saint who supported a family of 7 children, including my dad, and so this family dynamics just really has fascinated me. I mean, in the same family, you've got a post-manifesto polygamist married to a Mormon bishop, and you've got a career criminal, and you've got a guy who becomes my great uncle, who is the mission president, becomes close friends with David O. McKay when they're picking out the site for. If you've seen the book Saints, have you seen the new volume Saints, the third volume? Yeah. Take a look at the last part. It talks about my great uncle, the one that was the younger brother, and in this in studying this family dynamic. Anyway, when the first family, eventually the children of the first family find out what their father has been doing, and this oldest daughter, she goes ballistics when she finds out that her father, because he was able to keep it a secret from the children in this first family. When she finds out, she goes nuts. She's just absolutely irate. She ultimately, becomes disaffected from the church and everything else, and she feels her father's been really betrayed, and starts writing these polemics about how polygamy destroyed my family. She got this one memoir, and so it's interesting because my great uncle, the one who's the mission president, tries to comfort her. He writes her a letter saying it would have been better for all of us if this hadn't been kept a secret, that this post-manifesto polygamy took place in our family. It would have spared a lot of heartache and everything else. And he goes on to try to console this, this shirt tail, the half sister or whatever you want to call her, or not half sister, but this shirt tail relative, about what took place within our family, but he goes on to say. He was a young boy. He was just a young boy when he found out that his sister comes home pregnant. He goes on to say, well, I'll never forget when my sister Mamie came home pregnant. We thought she'd been violated by, some scoundrel or something like that. But then goes on to say, when we were told what it actually was, that it was post-manifesto polygamy, we were told that we had to keep it an absolute secret or Mamie would go to prison.
Oh.
I mean, that's, as I say, that's compelling history.
Yeah.
It's my family.
Wow.
As the Godfather would say, well, they didn't always do the right things, but they were my family.
Well, it's funny that you've done all this work on polygamy and didn't know.
I didn't realize that. I'll give you a copy of my paper when you leave. Remind me, I've got an extra copy, and you can read the full thing of what I wrote at Sunstone.
Oh, cool.
You'll find it interesting, I think.
Yeah. Well, cool.
Well, I probably said more than I should, huh?
No, you're great. You're great. So, any last thoughts before I let you go?
No, I'll actually be honest with you. I've enjoyed the intellectual stimulation that takes place in your podcast because I really appreciate the way that you handle gospel tangents, because you not only bring out information that I probably intend to bring out, but you bring out discussion and dialogue, which maybe takes it along, because I guess that's why you call it gospel tangents, because you get going on these interesting tangents and discussing issues that might not already be discussed, and that's why I always enjoy doing the gospel tangents.
Well, thank you. You're one of my favorites, Noel. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on Gospel Tangents. Really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Newell Bringhurst. Newell, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I'd encourage you all to check out his book, Harold B. Lee, Life and Thought. As you can see, it's a nice, thin biography. And it's a great book. You can learn more about President Harold B. Lee. In our next conversation, we've got another heavy hitter, Todd Compton from UCLA. So I was really surprised to find out he was an accidental historian, Mormon historian.
So she said, why don't you get one of these fellowships and where they pay you to study something? She said, they have the Eliza R. Snow journals, diaries there. So why don't you apply to work on the Eliza R. Snow diaries? And they'll pay you to come to the Huntington every day. And I thought it was a crazy idea, because I had no background in Mormon history.
Yeah, so your doctorate was in Greek and Latin?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I'd always been interested in Mormon history.
Right.
And but I'd never done any research in it.
The job market's not bad in Mormon history.
I wasn't thinking about getting a job in Mormon history. I wasn't expecting to get the fellowship, and so I sent it in, and then I totally forgot about it, because I was sure I wouldn't get it.
Right.
And then I got a letter in the mail, you've received the fellowship, to work on the diaries of Eliza R. Snow for a couple months.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.